Thank you everybody for joining us for our fourth webinar of Sexual Assault Awareness Month. This webinar is called Using Our Voices to Create a Consent Culture. And I'm so excited to have everybody here, everybody that was able to join us. You're all people that I love and I've always learned something from. So I'm really excited for this conversation. So I'm just going to start off with a quick introduction and then I'll have you all introduce yourselves as well. So my name is Stephany Murguia. I'm the Director of Education and Outreach at the Rape Recovery Center. And creating a consent culture is something that's really important to me, so I'm excited. We also have Hildegard Koenig. She is the Outreach Coordinator for the Utah Office for Victims of Crime. Hi, Hildy. We also have Andy Tremonte. They are the Outreach and Education Coordinator. I think I mixed those up. Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. We have Megan Asadian. She is the Outreach Coordinator for the Rape Recovery Center. And we have Flor Olivo. She is the Program Coordinator for the Women's Resource Center at the University of Utah. I think we'll just start with Flor. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. So, as Stephany said, I am a program coordinator at the Women's Resource Center over at the University of Utah. And then I'm also a parent of many young people and a member of, I would say, the Latinx community, but also I identify as a woman of color. And so a person that experiences the world through that lens. So I think that's how I'll introduce myself.
Thank you. How about you, Megan? Do you want to go next? You're on mute.
A notification. It was like, you are muted. And I was like, okay. My name is Megan. I'm the Outreach Coordinator at the Rape Recovery Center. I use she, her pronouns. And I guess similar to Flor, I also identify as a woman of color. I am half Iranian and half Afghan, and that definitely informs how I approach this work. And yeah. Oh, Stephany, I think you might be muted.
Bear with us, those that are watching. That'll probably happen a couple of times. As all of us are doing, we're relearning how to be together online. But Hildy, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation. My name is Hildegard Koenig. Everyone calls me Hildy. I am the Outreach Coordinator for the Utah Office for Victims of Crime. I am a first-generation immigrant to this country. I'm half Latina. From Venezuela and German, and I am a survivor myself. But the thing that I'm more proud is my two amazing children that have given the permission to identify they both are trans, and I am very proud mother for them. And so this work is very important as a woman of color, as a parent, as an ally, as a survivor, daughter, sister, auntie. To be able to continue this work to help those that have no voice. Thank you.
Great. And last, we'll have Andy introduce yourself.
Greetings. So I'm Andy Tremonte, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. And most of my work at the coalition is increasing access and trauma-informed care practices for working with Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA plus folks, and me personally identifying as a queer trans person. This is the topic of consent is something that has intersected and interacted with my life quite frequently. So yeah, it's quite important to let our community know that consent is still very important, and presented in ways that folks feel included. So thank you.
So just to start us off, because I think a lot of times we throw around the word consent, and specifically we're talking about consent culture today. Does anybody kind of want to share how you define a consent culture? or what that means to you.
I can start. So how I would define a consent culture is a culture where people have a say in what happens to them and the interactions and experiences that they have. I think that's a big part of it, is folks being able to make informed decisions and being able to say yes, say no, and even experience things fully or in a way that they are not being harmed in the process of.
Yeah, I can go next. I think I agree with those things, and I've been thinking about this a lot with my children who are all different ages. So I have 5 total, and there's some teens, and there's a tiny baby, and then there's some in between. And so I think it's important for each of us to be able to define what consent culture means for each of us individually, but then also in society as a whole. I think of it as being able to feel like, even children, to feel entitled to explore the world around us while being able to consent to things and have the most choices. And for me, that's been something that I've been thinking about a lot. Like, how can I be curious about the world and grow up in a world in a way that's safe, but that I can also do all the things that I'm supposed to do while being respectful of other people's consent, and then also being able to think about that for myself too.
Great, thank you.
I can go next. Alex, Floor, and Andy both shared, you know, consent coming from a culture that you, as a, that you didn't have choices. You were told this is what you have to do and this is what you're expected to do. Consent is such an important thing in having the voice, like I said earlier, but is also being able to, consent in so many different ways, from the moment of being able to hug someone, to a family member, to be able to grab, you know, to touch you, to give you a hug, a stranger, like so many different ways. And it's something as a survivor that I had to learn how to be able to say the word no is okay to say, and yes, and those words that a lot of times have been voiceless for us, like being able to, you know, you don't have the right to say those things. So consent is very deep in that part, and it's something that is a continuous thing and a daily thing that you have to practice in every way, and it will change as your life goes and your children and your life. So that's it.
Yeah. Megan, would you like to add anything?
Sure, yeah. I guess like a lot came up for me in that question. But just kind of like the first thought is like consent culture to me would be like a society or a culture that normalizes consent and also implements consent in a way that's not just in a sexual context, or like I think whenever we go in working for the Rape Recovery Center, for example, into high schools, and we talk about consent, people just kind of expect it because it's always associated with like sexual assault and things like that. But you know, consent really applies to not just like in your romantic relationship, but with your friends and like with your family. And so when I think of consent culture, I think of it in like that broader realm. And then the other thing too that I think of is consent culture is a culture where people, especially youth, feel empowered to kind of explore like how to communicate with folks in their lives, and understanding that sometimes consent can feel tricky, and it is a practice. And so yeah, consent culture definitely entails all those things.
Wow, that brought a lot of stuff up for me too. Just kind of reminding and grounding myself in how profound consent and building a consent culture can be. So thank you for sharing that. Because I think one of the things that we notice is that oftentimes working in this field, we can kind of get caught up in, well, consent is really simple, but I'm wondering if you all could share the ways that you create or are working towards creating a consent culture so that people have maybe tangible examples. And this could be professionally, but also personally, or just whatever comes up for you. I think it's important to have a breadth of experiences. And anyone can go.
I can go. Just because a lot of my work involves working with like youth, especially in high schools when we talk about consent. Really just going back to what I said about the fact that consent takes practice. And especially like living in a society that doesn't normalize consent, I think a lot of folks feel really stuck, especially like high school age, junior high age, when people start getting that consent messaging, they start feeling really stuck about how to practice it, or at least how to feel empowered when practicing it. And so that's something that I have tried to do in my workshops, is to kind of discuss that nuance, which feels really uncomfortable, to be completely honest. I think especially entering into this work, my first instinct was always like, you know, yes means yes, no means no. Like you have to kind of have that like, you know, clear-cut answer. But really diving into the work a little bit more, you start to realize that there is a lot of nuance for folks, not just in like understanding consent, but also in practicing consent or setting boundaries and things like that. And so that's something that, you know, I try to do as I work with youth in high schools.
How do you, I mean, do you mind me asking, Megan, like, how do you practice consent in those spaces? Like, what does that look like?
How do I practice consent?
Like, how would you do, because that really stood out to me, you know, you need to practice consent, but I'm wondering what that looks like, because I could imagine that maybe that would be jarring for someone to hear.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So a lot of ways that I have navigated that has been like how it like feels for somebody to say no or say yes to something. So what we'll do is we'll actually do like little exercises, and sometimes I'll like have scenarios. So, like one that I always use is if you're on a first date with somebody and it went really, really well and you want to kiss them, do you just go for it or do you ask? And then there's always like this mixed response. And then when I try to kind of like navigate those answers, I really try not to approach it as like, this is the right answer, this is the wrong answer. It's more like, what's coming up for you in that? Why would you maybe just want to go for it, right? Like, why is that important for you? Let's like navigate this a little bit more. And yeah, just kind of see like what comes up for folks when we go through those scenarios, or when we do like different exercises. So we have a fun nonverbal activity that's like, give as many fist bumps or high fives as you possibly can, or you get as many fist bumps or high fives as you can in a workshop, but it's a completely nonverbal activity. And so folks will then be like, you know, how do you know that this person wanted to give you a fist bump or a high five? Like, how could you tell? So kind of opening up a space for folks to be vulnerable, I guess is the right word, because it takes a large amount of vulnerability, especially in those spaces when you're with your peers, to kind of just talk about those things. And I think one thing that has really helped has been to take away that like right versus wrong mentality, and the shame-based mentality associated with it as well.
Thank you. So going back to our original question, and maybe the other panelists could answer, how do you work to create consent culture?
I could go. So as Megan was talking, I was thinking about young people that I work with, and oftentimes how this consent conversation is sometimes like really new for like a 14 or a 15-year-old, which if we think about that is kind of sad, because we should be thinking about creating a consent culture from the time that a person is born. And so I'm learning to do that for myself, even in going back and thinking about what if I knew what consent looked like when I was 3 years old, mm-hmm. or what if I knew what it meant when I was 5 or 7, or, you know, and I do think that consent looks different in all stages of life. And as I'm learning for myself, I'm also learning to facilitate that learning for all of the young people in my life. And even also the adults, like practicing like saying no, or saying, you know, I don't want to talk about that right now, let's revisit this later, or just learning what that looks like in everyday relationships. And then I was thinking of like tangible examples for like, just even with my baby, like I do think that little things like force feeding them or guilting them into doing something, or like tickling them or giving them a hug without asking, or sometimes I just feel like squeezing them and like, you know, giving them kisses or things like that. And so that for me as an adult who's responsible for someone's upbringing, I've had to check myself on that a lot, and like learning that I shouldn't do those things. And even if it's part of maybe my culture or even the cultural nuances in our own communities, like that sometimes it takes like being brave, and then also like having to say, okay, well, I know that we do that, but I don't want to do that with my kids. And so having to set those boundaries sometimes can be really hard. But then I feel like it involves mostly checking myself as a person that has the most power around young people. And like knowing that they're really looking at the way that I'm modeling those things for them. And that if I say an example with my teenager, I like taking pictures of my kids, and then an example is maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, she was probably like 10 or 11. She was like, did you take a picture and post it? And you didn't even ask me. And then I was like, well, you're my daughter. And then I was like, fine, I'll take it down. And so that like really checked me. Like, I do need to, even little things like that, like posting a picture or sharing an experience or those kind of things, like without asking, are not okay. And so I'm learning, and I feel like what you said, Megan, that it's a practice and that we practice it. I feel like every year I learn a new way of doing it. And so that's also a process for me, and knowing that consent is going to always look different in all the different stages of my life.
I was going to jump in. The way, you know, working, and thank you, Flora and Megan. And so working with Planned Parenthood, I was working a lot with the Latino community and with the parents and the youth, and talking about the cultural, right, and what consent looks like. And like I shared before, about like hugging your auntie or give your uncle the kiss. And, you know, that looks really bad if you don't do it, you know. And so having that conversation with parents, like, why is that child not wanting at that moment, right? Or, you know, if it's okay to say it's all right, and do a handshake. And so, but also with that, it's been working with the trans community and the LGBTQ2S+ community about, you know, like, it's okay to, you know, if someone, you know, say, you know what, I don't want to give you a hug. It's okay to say that. Do not touch me. Asking those things. And I think as Megan said it, and Flor, it is a constant, we have to practice it. And being able to say to people, even just to say, is it okay if I borrow this from you? Or is it okay if I grab this from your desk? Even if they say, oh, just grab it. Is that all right? You know, just questioning those things. And it's okay to change your mind too, if you choose not to do that. And I think that's something that for a long time on consent, we say, well, but you told me yes before. Why you cannot say now? You know, you're saying no. And so even if it's your child saying, no, don't post a picture of me, you know, even just before I asked my kid, can I identify you both are trans, you know, because that can change. They could, they don't want to say those things. So asking that consent is something we have to practice. And if anyone knows me, I'm a huggy person, but I have learned to kind of try to be step back and be like, is it okay if I give you a hug? Is it okay if I do that? You know, so it's just a practice we have to, whatever we are. And I think everyone is something we all can learn. And I don't think you ever stop learning, and it will change as we continue.
Yeah, I'd like to piggyback on a lot of what everyone has said. I think me personally and the work that I've done, and even professionally and personally, I guess, like having those conversations are really important, especially, you know, in the culture and community I grew up. You know, I grew up in Utah, I grew up LDS, and those are conversations that we, you know, simply didn't have, right? And conversations that, you know, weren't okay to have. And I think it is really interesting too, because even when we like talk about it, even when we address it, even if it's just the definition and ask, hey, do y'all agree with this? Do you not agree with it? What thoughts? What are some things that come up? It's almost like giving people permission to not only talk about it, but also ask for consent for other people. And I think it's really interesting too, when y'all were talking, it brought up kind of some experiences during, you know, some of my work and the trainings and stuff that I do. And when we have conversations about consent, I think people, in my experience, you know, have tended to I guess more broadly or more often understand the idea of asking other people for consent. And I think it's difficult for a lot of people to also realize that consent means that I can say no. Consent means that I can say yes. And so I think that's really interesting. And I know that it's been helpful to meet people with empathy and validate, you know, those experiences and those feelings, and, you know, kind of give them a place to talk about the things that are hard, some of the barriers that they have faced when experiencing, talking about, and even interacting with the ideas of consent. So
Oh, yeah. It feels like the elephant in the room, but obviously we're social distancing right now. We're in the middle of the pandemic. And I'm wondering, I'm so curious because all of you work in this field to some extent. You work with youth, you work in the community. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on what this looks like as we're social distancing or as we're at home, whatever that looks like for people, and really exploring the opportunities, but maybe also the barriers or issues that you're seeing come up that are unique to this time.
Ooh, I'll start us off, I guess. I think this is a really interesting time. And of course, you know, definitely not wanting to minimize, you know, people's experiences and the things that are happening. I think this is almost like a case study on consent, right? We are not allowed, or we are, you know, social distancing ourselves to, you know, potentially help save and protect others and ourselves and our families. And it's also putting us in this position where people may be asking like, hey, I know that, you know, social distancing, blah, 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 but do you want to take the kids to the park? Or, hey, come over for dinner. Haven't seen you for a while, right? And it's this kind of interesting place that we're in. And is it harder or is it easier to say no? Right? Is it harder or is it easier to bring up some of these things that you're uncomfortable with? And, you know, I'm sure folks have seen, you know, that the increases of victimization and requests for services and, you know, shelter and advocacy in many areas have increased so significantly, and in other areas have decreased significantly because people don't know if they can get services. So I think it's this interesting place where people are being put in a position where they almost, you know, have to address the idea of consent every day.
Yeah, I definitely think I noticed the first time I went to the grocery store how much like people touch each other that I had never noticed. Like, and it was just this thing because you're so hyper aware, but it's very interesting. What about Flor, Megan, and Hildy? What have you noticed, or what are some opportunities or challenges right now?
I can go again. So, well, one thing that I have realized in my own life while all of this has happened is that I've realized how much privilege we have in many different ways. Even as a marginalized person, I have so many privileges in this country and in this state and all of the things that I have in my life. And so it's made me be very aware of that and also be able to differentiate what things I can consent to and what things I can't consent to, and sort of some of the choices that are being limited. But it's also made me realize that there's a lot of people that don't have that many choices. And so also thinking about what that means in connection to consent, and maybe not being able to leave a home where you know, you're experiencing things that you shouldn't be experiencing, or what that could mean for children, what that could mean for adults, what that could mean really for entire communities. And so for me, that's something that I've been very aware of, that it's made me acknowledge that with myself, talk about it with my family, even when they feel like, because I feel like when you're or learning or practicing consent, you're also learning like where consent ends and where it's like a boundary, or where it's you know, something that you need to do out of safety or out of respect. And so I feel like I've been able to explore that a lot. Like when my kids are like, well, I'm not consenting to being locked up at home, you know, like, well, this is where that connects to other people's consent, and where it connects to other people's safety, and where it connects to all these other things. And so it's like a blurry, I feel, line often, but then this is allowing for us to have more conversations about it because we have to. And so that's what it's brought up for me.
Yeah, I'm really glad people keep bringing up how complicated consent can be, but how important it is.
And I was gonna share, so you know, I have thought about the privilege too, to be able to work from home, have a computer, have devices that I can communicate with people. But as someone that has a disability and a high risk, you know, I'm keep being told you can't leave the house, and you know, you can't go here, and then I feel like I've been put in like an isolation farther, which I think about people that are not in a safe space, you know, and consent and not being able to have that, how dangerous that could be. But also, you know, just the thought of like when people will drop off stuff at my house to help me, and I think that's, you know, the kindest thing. But if I was someone that I was living on my own, and you know, and because some people have said, oh, I'll just bring it into your house. I don't want you coming into my home because I'm a high risk, and you know, and not that I don't believe that you don't have anything, but because of my health. But if I was, you know, someone that maybe disabled and not isolated, they don't have anyone, not being able to say no, or feeling bad of saying no when someone comes into their home, you know, the high risk of, you know, that word consent. You know, once again, we've been told, normalized to say yes to everything, and say no is not okay. And more with people that you've been isolated, that you may feel alone, you want to see people is a natural thing. But you know, I just see the high risk, and I see more people touching and people not respecting, and when you go to places and you know, that touch, and I'm like, it's my bubble, you know, and asking people, please do not touch this, and people don't respect that. So I think that consent, we have to practice it, but in this I've seen it more, and this is a great time to be able to have that conversation with your children, with the community, on, you know, it's okay, you know, to say, please do not touch this for me, and just kind of like Flora said, you know, being able, like, this is the reason why you can't go out. but, or this is the reason why you cannot come in, and it's okay to say no. And so, but as you know, I just been thinking about the very vulnerable population, people with disabilities in this time. So.
Oh, Stephany, I think you're muted.
Megan, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agreed with all of these different points. And I think for me personally, what's been really interesting and unique is consent actually feels a little bit, not even a little bit, like a lot harder to navigate, because I always say, like, when I teach consent, I always say, like, consent is very much so associated to like what your personal boundaries are. Like your boundaries inform how you practice consent and things like that. And so like nowadays, like our boundaries, like especially physically, look very different, right? And you know, there's a lot of like, I live with roommates and they're really wonderful, but it was definitely like an adjustment as to like what is okay and what's not okay. And trying to navigate what boundaries are appropriate that are also rooted in like the well-being of other people. And so consent definitely looks very different in that sense. And so navigating like, you know, can people come over to our house or not? Like, you know, that makes me, or like this really low risk thing that still kind of makes me feel really uncomfortable because I live with somebody who's high risk, things like that, right? And so I definitely think it's an important conversation to have. Interestingly enough, I've had with my roommates, and it was actually a really cool conversation. We kind of, when I talked about like going with how people feel and being really vulnerable, I tried that. Believe it or not, I tried to practice what I preach, and you know, it was like I felt really uncomfortable, even though this like interaction with this outside person was really short. And I want to talk about that. I didn't consent to this as a roommate, as somebody who lives here, and I want to talk about that. And it actually ended up being a really good conversation. But yeah, I think it's definitely, it's created some challenges, things that were totally fine and normal now, like aren't that way. And that definitely informs how we practice consent.
A couple of you mentioned the idea of like being privileged, and kind of the flip side of that is utilizing your privilege to be like a good ally and to dismantle some, you know, systems of oppression. And I'm wondering how you all kind of work towards that, how you all incorporate allyship into your work around consent, or even just what's going on right now.
That's a big question. Can you repeat the question?
So just because you all have mentioned being privileged, right? And part of having privilege is using that to be good allies and to help kind of dismantle those systems that allow you privilege. My question is, I also kind of just made it up on the spot, so with me, answer whatever part you feel like answering. How do you use your privilege, or how do you use your allyship in your quest to provide or to create a consent culture?
I can start. So I try to think about this in my work, like because even within the university, even though there's people who are more marginalized than others, etc., but essentially it is a huge institution that has a lot of power. And so for me, what that has looked like in my space is listening to what people need, and then providing the most information and the most resources that I can so that people have access to the most choices. And so I feel that's kind of broad, but I feel like I can't really approach allyship or consent without having that as my base structure to think about things. And so I think listening, so that's what I'll say, listening to what people need, and then doing my own work to see how much access and information I can provide to that person so that they have the most access to the most choices.
I did kind of want to mention, we did get a question through Facebook. And I think it's like a clarifying question potentially, but the question was, how do you become more vulnerable when it comes to consent? Which is a really good question. Stephany, since you kind of framed the question, do you wanna go ahead and answer that? Like, how does one become more vulnerable when it comes to consent?
I think they said practicing, and I think they were referring to your comment. But what are your thoughts? I'm happy to add to it, but also I think we could all.
Yeah. Well,
vulnerability.
Vulnerability is so hard. I just got triggered. I was like,
yeah. So how do you become more vulnerable when it comes to consent? I want to make sure I'm understanding this question correctly. So if I'm answering this like incorrectly, I apologize. What my first thought is like, how could somebody like maybe how do you become more vulnerable when it comes to consent?
I think I have a thought.
Yeah, I'm having a little, I'm sure thoughts will form, but I would actually like to hear yours, Stephany.
Sure. I have a good friend that whenever they're moderating, they'll just join the panel. So I'm going to do that right now. I think for me, I think back to, I think what Flor mentioned, that I didn't grow up knowing consent at all. So it actually feels really difficult to do that in my personal life. In my professional life, it feels really easy because I've been doing it for so long. But personally, I always have this like traumatic reaction to it. I do a lot of what I think therapists call fawning. We're all just like I forget, I don't have the official definition, but it's when trauma survivors will like overcompensate by like being really kind and kind of just saying yes to everything. And so for me, being vulnerable equals just being really honest. And I think sometimes, and being okay with people's reactions and actually being vulnerable with myself. Like, I feel really bad because I said no right now, but it's okay. You can feel bad, but that was still a good boundary. But I think vulnerability can look different for everybody.
Oh, for sure. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that was what was being asked. Like, how do you practice vulnerability when it comes to consent? And kind of going into that, I think for me personally, in my own personal life, it really is about like understanding how I'm feeling. Believe it or not, that tends to be like a little bit harder, easier said than done a lot of the time. I think especially when it comes to normalizing feeling uncomfortable, I think a lot of folks grow up like being taught to normalize like feeling uncomfortable, especially like girls and women, when it comes to like, you know, having certain boundaries broken. And so like part of that was really acknowledging when I felt uncomfortable, really like kind of like recognizing that, and then like also advocating for myself, even if it seemed silly or in my head, right? Like if I was like, oh, this is such a small thing, but it kind of bothered me, but maybe I should just shove it to the side. Part of being vulnerable when it comes to practicing consent is really just kind of naming what I'm feeling, if I think it's important, right? And one of the things that I've learned is that the folks who have really cared about me in my life want me to do that, right? Like, and it goes like both ways, right? Like if I really care about somebody, or really just in any relationship that I have with somebody, I want them to also feel vulnerable enough where they can share when they feel uncomfortable. And also I would like to add, the person who submitted that question, they said that they were going to try to clarify, but we are answering it, I think, how they wanted us to answer. I feel really good about myself. Yay.
That's excellent. Can I piggyback off what you said, Megan? So I think for me, naming that vulnerability, and even lately in personal life, you know, I've said, okay, I'm going to be vulnerable here, and then say whatever, right? And it's kind of given me this, you know, like, okay, this is what I'm feeling. I'm naming it. I'm putting it out there, and it's okay. And I think part of that it's okay is practicing that self-compassion and understanding that, or attempting to understand, let's be real, that, you know, being vulnerable is a part of life. It's a way that builds, you know, intimacy in relationships, intimacy being defined as emotional closeness. And especially with like the work that we do during this time, and, you know, folks who are experiencing victimization, that could also be difficult too, is that when we're experiencing this vulnerability, sometimes we're hard on ourselves and say, oh, you're weak. But yeah, in reality, it's like, hey, look at you being a little vulnerable, Goose, right now, right? Look at you, you know, honoring your own feelings and experience. So there's a couple cents for you.
Okay. So going back to the question about allyship, did anyone have any thoughts on that as far as like how we can use privilege or what that looks like right now? I know what I've been noticing is that it does feel like a case study right now of everything that's right and kind of wrong with the world. And one of the things that is so glaring is the privilege that a lot of people don't have, and the kind of flip side, the ways that some communities have really been insulated. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are, or we can move on if we're kind of done with that question.
I think the couple things that I would say is, you know, including that the empowerment piece to it, and kind of meeting folks where there are, I think other folks said this too, is what do I have access to? What can I do? And share with other people without speaking over them or for them or pushing things upon them, but in a way that's empowering and allows for them to choose their own path and for them to consent, basically, in what they do and what they feel most comfortable with. Yeah.
I'm just going to piggyback quickly on this, and so we can go on. But I think education, empowerment. Right now, everyone is just looking at social media, is looking at everything what they can. But I think it just let them know that the resources and let them choose whenever they are. But I think it also takes the work that we have done in the past of building that trust with community, and for them to, when they are ready to reach out, to be able to provide that resources or information. But I think having that privilege, being able to have that knowledge of sometimes of things that many people may not have, or even they can relate, that you can relate to them in some steps. And some individuals will reach out for those reasons because they say, you know, I know that you went through this and this is what I'm going through. And so in that moment, we can either empower them or not, you know, so I think that part.
Yeah.
Go on.
Great. So we'll do our last official question, and then we can go to the audience, or if you all have anything you want to add. What do you want people to know about consent or sexual violence? Like, what's your kind of last announcement for people? Or if you could only say one more thing, what would it be?
I can start us off again. Yes? Okay. So I think the main thing for me is that consent is a constant negotiation of what things I'm responsible for and what things I have no control over. So committing to that and remembering that as long as you continue to practice it, it will continue to evolve. And I mean that in every sense of the word, like at work, with family, with your friends. The day will come when people will be like, oh, well, she has boundaries.
Yeah.
And it may take a while, even with family or with different people, or it may be sad. You might have to stop talking to someone for a little while until they learn to respect your boundaries or your feelings even. And I think being okay with that it's not easy, but I feel like in my personal life, it's worth it. And so that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Flor.
I can go. I think what I would tell folks and what I have told folks is, you know, in like really simplified terms, like you matter, like your feelings matter. And if you feel uncomfortable or if something doesn't feel right, that matters, even if it seems like quote unquote silly or small. It's not. Like your feelings of safety and well-being do matter. And so I think when it comes to like that practice of consent, you know, again, it is a practice, right? It involves a lot of communication, but I think a part of that is also like recognizing that when you do feel uncomfortable, that's something that, you know, is valid and important to pay attention to.
Megan literally said word for word what I had written down. I was
That's
like,
great.
I swear, like, Megan, you and I sometimes are like literally same page, same like word, everything. So
Yeah, exactly.
I mirror everything that Megan just said.
What about you, Hildy? What's your...
They're both all repeating words that I was gonna say, you know, being able to recognize, you know, those feelings, and then you matter. The consent is something that we go on. It will be education, and if we, you know, and I'll go in my, what's it called, soap opera? No, soapbox, whatever it's called. But, it, those words in English. But so one of the things I was thinking is like the education. If we can start having that conversation with your kids at a younger age, and you know, even as a parent, we're like, we are the parent, or we're like, we're the adult, or whatever location, or we're the elders, or you know, is okay to and recognize that and talk about that. And maybe why does it feel uncomfortable for you? And that is a really important conversation, but that opens that communication with your friends, with your children. But it's something that has been such a taboo not to talk about, and that we need to change that. It's something that we have to, as a community, as everyone. So.
Yeah. We do have one question from the audience. The question is, what are some fun ways I can practice consent in quarantine with my family, roommates, friends, or partners?
I feel like if we can make consent just part of our everyday life, then that, for me, that automatically includes fun in it. Like I would say, even like with even sometimes making light of it, or like, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to ask about this, or I forgot to do this, or just like being able to acknowledge it all the time. And then I think that there's also fun ways that you can explore that with your partners, in learning what each other like, or can or what each other think is funny, because sometimes you think something's funny but someone else doesn't. And so even exploring that, I think, is important. But again, I think if you just really commit to making consent conversation a part of your life, then it can be fun too. It doesn't have to always be like this negative like cloud over, you know, like things. I think sometimes when we think about consent, we are like, oh gosh, I have to ask. Like it can be fun and like sexy and like, you know, all the things, as long as it's always a part of what we're doing.
I like had a few thoughts, because I think a huge part of my job is finding ways to have fun conversations about consent. And sometimes I fail. It's just awkward, but I think I don't have kids. I don't know what it's like to be a parent. But I do think there was like one time when Stephany, who is a parent, mentioned something that I thought was really interesting. But if you're like specifically wanting to like practice consent with your kids, or having them like be aware of consent, Stephany had mentioned like, if you have pets, that's a really great way to do that. Like Stephany and I both have cats, and Stephany had talked about like how she talks with her child about like, I don't know, practicing consent and being aware of what their cat wants and doesn't want, which sounds a little strange, but I thought about it and I was like, gosh, I've picked up my cat so many times when he did not want to be picked up, and it was because I wanted to hug him. But you know, like in a sense, like that's really, especially as a child, really important to think about and be mindful about. And I think when you practice that skill of like being mindful of how other people, and not even just human beings, but like any like living creature around you feels when you do certain things, that's a really good skill to normalize. And it probably sounds like strange, but I thought about it and I was like, that's pretty smart. Like, especially
I love it.
yeah.
Me too. I like that a
I
lot.
stole it from Stephany. It wasn't mine.
But although Megan will send me pictures that say, I don't like cat boundaries. And
I don't like
not
that.
cat.
I love my cat. I just want to hold him all the time, but I have to be aware of his boundaries.
So I was gonna add, I mean, I think of a fun way right now that you're home and a lot of people are watching movies, and maybe being able to have a conversation after the movie about what, you know, and I have done this with my children and with, you know, it's like what's healthy, unhealthy, you know, what was consent, you know, have those conversations. And I mean, I remember when, I know Twilight is a long time ago, but my youngest, we were in the movie and my kid is like, Mom, they were saying it's a stalking, the person watching them over the night, watching them in bed. I was like, yes. Yeah, so, you know, we were watching the, you know, and it was like that conversation. Yes, they were raised by a mom in social justice advocate work, right? But having that conversation of like, why that, you know, maybe it's something that maybe was healthy, they don't think is healthy, and maybe just having that, you know, why do you feel, and maybe the conversations will happen, and that can open things that you will learn from your children too, or your family members, or anyone that you don't know, your roommates, whatever.
Yeah, I think
I love that.
all those. I really love that you talked about media, because I think that's such a great opportunity. I've been watching a lot of TikTok, and there's like these challenges where they play like
She has.
I have, because I send them to her all the time. I'm like, this is so funny. 5 videos later. But I was even thinking there's like video reaction videos to like a different video. Like you show your parents this like raunchy music video and you like show them reacting. I think those are hilarious, but also just a good conversation around anything, right? Like consent, but also the videos. Sometimes the parents are reacting from a place that maybe is, you know, their own bias. And I've seen some really great kind of conversations around that.
Yeah, I feel like the truth about Disney movies will come out during this time. You're like, wait, I don't remember that part. Yeah.
Great. So we have
Disney movies, I'm sorry.
You have to be careful when you're talking about Disney movies, because in my experience, people are like, you hate Disney, and I'm like, no,
Yeah.
I'm critical.
Just to kind of wrap us up, just so people know what resources exist and, you know, what resources you all are part of, do you want to just briefly mention, you know, how people can contact you or your agency for more information about, you know, the programs that you offer?
I can start. Okay, so the Women's Resource Center is at the University of Utah. We're currently doing a lot of online programming that includes like trivia nights and study sessions, and then a couple of like short yoga videos for mindfulness. So you can find all of that at our website at womenscenter.utah.edu. or on our Instagram at UofUWRC.
Thank you, Floyd. Megan.
All right.
Yep. Or Andy. Go ahead.
The cat's starting to meow a lot, so
Okay.
go when he's in a lull. Yeah, Todiko has a lot to say about this right now. Okay, so for the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition, you can visit us online at udvc.org, and you can find out about upcoming webinars. I'm doing a webinar every Thursday at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. Those are free. Welcome to register for them on a number of different topics. Also, our 24-hour, 7-day-a-week domestic violence crisis hotline is still open. So if folks are, worried about something that's happening in their home, friends, family, during this time, or in general, they may think that they are, experiencing intimate partner violence, call. We're still open. We still have a whole bunch of resources. And that number is 1-800-897-LINK, LINK. And you can find that on our website, on our Facebook, all that. So, yep.
Thank you, Andy.
Okay. I can go with the Utah Office for Victims of Crime. We have the reparation program, which is for individuals that have been victim of a crime. And they can qualify. You can contact our office 801-238-2360 or 1-800-621-7444. And it is for someone that they've been victims of suffer from physical or psychological injury or death direct to a criminal injury conducted by another. And one of the things that people can qualify for is they may qualify for is case-by-case basis, but medical care, dental care, mental health counseling, funeral, burial, relocations, loss of earnings, child care, or loss of supported dependents, but they can contact and speak with the advocates there, which they can assist them. And also, we have our complaint procedure, victims' rights. We're starting to talk more about victims' rights statewide, and I think it's something that we need to know. And there's a complaint process. So if you feel like you've been your rights have been violated, criminal justice, there you can go into our website, and I'll have to read it because my brain is not there today. So it's a crime. So you can Google justice.utah.gov, and you can go in there, and it just talks about the complaint, talks about victims' rights and the complaint procedure, and you can fill that out, and that comes to me, and I'll go to our council, victims' rights council, and they'll review that and get back to you. So there's a lot of things that we want to make sure that we are making sure people's voices are heard, and people know that we have rights, no matter what type of crime you've been.
Yeah. And last, Megan.
Okay, so the Rape Recovery Center, we offer a lot of different services for those who have been impacted by sexual violence, so primary and secondary survivors, those directly impacted, and also the friends and family of. We typically serve folks through counseling, victim advocacy, and therapy. One thing that I want folks to be mindful of is that we do still have our crisis line. So if folks need like after hours support, it's a 24/7 line. And right now we can offer that, that service in both English and in Spanish. So when folks call into that line, they can press 1 for an English speaking advocate and a Spanish speaking advocate. That number is 801-467-7273. And yeah, so if folks like are curious about services or kind of want to maybe potentially access services in the future, please feel free to do so. And then also, like, just generally, where the department that Stephany and I work in is outreach and education, and we are in the middle of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which is held in April of every year. If you are tuning in, you probably know about it because this is part of our Sexual Assault Awareness Month programming, but the theme that we've come up with this year is Our Voices, which really ties into this conversation really well, using our voices to create a consent culture, to keep talking about these issues and to advocate for survivors. But all throughout the year, our team will go to schools, will go to different outreach events, and we talk about these issues It's not just 1 month that we're spreading awareness of this, it's year round. So if you want to schedule an online webinar, or if you're curious about what presentations we can do or some topics that we can cover, feel free to shoot me an email. I don't know if, I guess I can, should I just say my email, or should I just, you can
find it on our website at www.raperecoverycenter.org. So thank you so much. You guys have been amazing panelists. And thank you to everybody that was able to join us through Zoom and through Facebook Live. Just as Megan mentioned, this is a Sexual Assault Awareness Month. We do have a webinar tomorrow on self-care. So our theme this week is self-care, and our amazing clinical team is doing some meditation and creation tomorrow. And then on Sunday, Jorge, our prevention coordinator, will be having his virtual happy hour with Post Office Place. So if you want to have another conversation about consent, but this time with alcohol, that's your place to be. But thank you, everybody, and that's it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.